It is still an undefeated record for Oklahoma as they meet Texas Tech this weekend. But of course, if you look a little bit deeper, we know what the issues have been and continue to be for this football team. We will continue here to talk Oklahoma football with each one of you every week. We got Jason Ray, of course, on the line from Last Word on College Football as he makes this show go. Jason, how you doing today?
Wonderful, Mark. Thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I am doing well. And I got to say that I had no intent of watching any Oklahoma Kansas football last Saturday, and I ended up watching Oklahoma Kansas in the second half because 10-0. Yeah, that got my attention. Not that I thought it was insurmountable by any stretch, obviously, but it got my attention. Then I thought, let's wait. I'm still locked in on these other games. I'm gonna wait to see a little bit, and then it got mid third quarter. And of course, 17-7 in that range was what I saw, like mid third quarter to the rest of the game. And yeah, they certainly blew by Kansas, took the win, but it in no way was easy. And was something that we, just like everybody else, took for granted. At this point last week, we were talking and laughing about Kansas football, but it was much closer than expected.
Yeah, it really was, Mark. And I think we've talked a lot about Oklahoma's quarterback situation and stuff. Maybe underperforming a little bit earlier on in the year, but I think more of the onus has been on the defensive side of the ball. It's become, I think, Mark, a little bit of a blueprint against this team, and how to play this team is really run the clock, convert third downs, and really keep the Oklahoma offense off the field. So Kansas got the ball. They drove, took about almost a little bit over 9 minutes off the clock on their opening drive, went right down the field. And then Oklahoma was pressing a little bit on offense. Caleb Williams threw his first interception of the year in the first half. And the offense really just wasn't able to get a whole lot going as well. I mean, a lot of it just had to do with them not being on the field as much, and then they were able to get on the field a little bit more in the second half. Oklahoma did get a turnover, which helped as well down the stretch. But Mark, the defense continues to be a problem, continues to be an area of concern for this team based on what they looked like coming into the season. Lack of aggressiveness is being seen there. The defensive line is not playing well. You're just seeing, I think, one thing that's been very prototypical of a Grinch coach defense for Oklahoma over the last couple of years is guys flying to the football, tons of effort, and you're not seeing that. There's a couple of, and this was kind of going through social media this week. There's a couple of areas where you saw players just walking around while the plays were actually happening. So I think there's a lot of concern on the effort, what Grinch is able to get out of these kids right now, because they are that's been the bugaboo for this program over the last 5-10 years. The offense has consistently been good enough to win championships, and they're probably good enough this year. I mean, it remains to be seen how Caleb Williams will play against some of this tougher competition in November, but for the third straight week, they've run the ball for over 200 yards. So I think that's a very strong positive. But yeah, the defense they're hurt. They've got about 4 or 5 guys that are starting. So you take that are typically a starting group that are out because of injuries. So I think that's one of the things that's making them struggle. They're juggling people around in the secondary. So one of the telltale signs has been over the last couple of years, Oklahoma has been really, really good on third down defense. I think in the neighborhood of 25 to 30% conversion percentage, and this year they're up in the upper 40s. So one of the worst in the country. So I think that's the key, maybe even above all else defensively, just not being able to consistently get off the field.
Yeah, Jason, I think it's pretty easy to confirm at this point. even though I don't like to speculate on the thought process of individuals, but that there's a portion of the team, what number that is, that seems to just think that everything's going to be okay. That maybe going into a game like this, it's Kansas. How bad do we have to play to lose this game? It just can't happen. It's impossible. We're not going to lose this game, so I don't really have to give that much effort. Or in previous games, it's going to be okay until proven wrong. We haven't lost a game, so we can just flip the switch whenever we feel like it.
Yeah, and I think this was a little bit, not in terms of struggling to this degree, Mark, but I think coming off of how well they played and how emotional the last 2 weeks were against Texas and then TCU to a certain degree. I, going to Kansas where the fan base is obviously not engaged, an 11 a.m. game. I thought that there would be a little bit of a flatness to this, but certainly not to that degree. To be down, not even score a point against one of the worst teams in America, definitely I think the worst FBS or Power Five FBS team in the country, and then really just struggle. Yeah, they scored 35 points in the second half, but they go up by, I think it was 13 points or 12 points, and then Kansas goes right back down the field in like 4 or 5 plays on Oklahoma's defense, and they need a one of the smartest, headiest plays I've ever seen. They need that, or they're, to your point, how bad do they have to be to lose? I mean, you're getting ready to find out how, you know what I mean? Because Kansas takes over the ball there around midfield area, only down by less than a touchdown. So, I don't know if this is a wake up call. I know that Grinch has continuously talked in the media just about how the sense of urgency really needs to be there, because they got Tech, they got a bye week, and then they've got they've got the gauntlet that is November. Traditionally, Oklahoma has played extremely well in November, so it's so odd to talk about. Oklahoma has the longest winning streak in the country right now. They're undefeated, and it feels like when you watch them, this is a 2 or 3 loss team already. I mean, they've been the benefit of winning, a lot of close games. They've got the Western Carolina game that was a blowout. Other than that, there's no other games that have been, won comfortably. I know the TCU margin was 21, but Oklahoma scored a late touchdown to make that 21. So it's not, it's not what you would expect. I know a lot of people are up in arms about some of the rankings, but when you look at Oklahoma just from a trajectory of the season, now it may not necessarily bode well for the playoffs, but if you win the rest of your games by 1 point, you're in if you're Oklahoma. But however, the competition goes up dramatically after that. So people that are frustrated about the rankings, or even the college football playoff rankings when they come out, I believe next week is the first one.
Yes.
So even if Oklahoma's like 4 or 5 or 6, and that, I mean, it'll take care of itself at some point. So I was, honestly, myself watching the games, I was surprised that they only dropped one spot. If it was me, I would have jumped. I would have put Ohio State ahead of Oklahoma. Just they've looked much better, and specifically when you look at the competition. I mean, Indiana is a better football team than Kansas, right? I mean, I think we would all agree with that, and they handled their business in a very dominating way. And I think that's one of the problems that Oklahoma has had kind of culturally is within this program, where they play down to the level of competition too much, and they don't have whatever it is, that it factor, that killer instinct, whatever you need to have to be able to put some of these teams away and dominate. And they're not doing that, and even to a higher degree this year than it's been in the past.
One side note about putting that in further perspective about the Kansas Indiana comparison would be that Indiana is only 2-5, They've lost 5 games to top 10 teams. Penn State dropped out just this past poll, but had lost 5 games though. So
Right.
they've played a brutal schedule, and they played all those games close. Penn State, that got to be a sizable win eventually, 24-0. But all those games were close against those top 10 teams. And then Ohio State, my goodness, they had 44 points at halftime. They were naming the score. It was like nothing. So anyway, just that comparison's interesting that you, and I think it's a fair evaluation just to look at the teams and say, hey, if you know football, understand football, and look past the score and just watch these teams play, we can make comparisons across the nation, taking into account the level of competition and the opponents, but that Oklahoma's not, they're winning the games, not playing well. A team like Ohio State, for example, is playing well, now has just annihilated a number of teams in a row, but 3 consecutively within the conference that are, again, not great teams, but somewhat capable teams.
Right.
And that aren't losing by that score to anyone else. So yeah, it'll be interesting. A week from today, we will have those rankings released from the previous night to review that, because Oklahoma, for as lowly as they've been ranked by me because of their performance throughout the season, because of other teams losing games, they've elevated in my rankings. So I have them higher than I believe they are, meaning I have them ranked based on their resume higher than the level at which they're playing right now. But yeah, they continue to get it done. And to your point, just the lunacy of Kansas having the ball at midfield down 28-23 with about 3 minutes left in the game, had that play not taken place with Caleb Williams. And I know it was controversial, but based on what I saw, it was obviously a heads-up play. I didn't see it to be that controversial. I know that Kennedy Brooks was very close to the line, but seemed to be the correct call to make.
Yeah, no, I think in any event, it was to your point, Mark, it was a really heady play, especially for a true freshman who hadn't played as much. And I think in a lot of ways, the way Caleb Williams played in the second half, he kind of bailed. He bailed out the defense a lot. So, yeah, I mean, and I think I've come on here a couple of times and talked about a little bit of a cultural problem, and it just seems to be manifesting itself, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. I think the leadership factor that Caleb, I think, brings to the table, I think, helps things both on the offense and the defensive side of the ball. But I think when you got players just walking around, when you got players, when you give up 23 points to we give it 23 points to Kansas. Like, Kansas hasn't competed against anyone really this year, specifically in the Big 12. I think the closest loss was like 38 points to Texas Tech, 45-7. So, yeah, I mean, they're playing with fire. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, yes, they're winning. They're finding ways to win these games, but they're playing with fire, and to a point where November, I mean, yeah, they can probably play like this and find a way to beat Texas Tech this week, but they're not going to be able to do that to beat Baylor, Iowa State, and Oklahoma State. So they've got to figure out, and part of it's getting some kids back, which I think they're going to start getting some kids back this week. De'Aaron Turner-Yell should be back, I think, this week for Texas Tech. Jalen Redmond on the defensive line should be back as well. And then there's one more on the defensive side. Oh, DJ Graham should be back. So that's going to help a little bit, but just in terms of the desire and the effort was probably the most concerning thing for me over the last couple of games, just to see that. And they're shuffling people around, Mark. They've got Key Lawrence, who has been a safety, and they've moved him to cornerback this week. I don't know. I don't know if it's a permanent thing. I don't know if they're just kind of getting some reps there from a depth perspective, or if he's a guy that they're thinking about maybe moving there. And I think it's probably an effort to just try to get your best 11 kids on the field. at the same time, but it seems a little desperate and a little, I mean, late to be moving a kid that's, I don't know that he's ever played cornerback. Maybe in high school. I don't know. I mean, at Tennessee he didn't play, and this year he hasn't played corner, obviously. So yeah, there's a lot of things that they need to get figured out in the short term and the backside of the defense, because they don't have a whole lot of time to waste.
I just got done recording a segment with SB Nation on Texas Tech, so be looking out for that. I'm going to post it right here on the Oklahoma channel because it's the obvious matchup coming up this week. So we talked about Oklahoma, Texas Tech, and of course, interesting situation there with the Red Raiders. That whoops. Anyway, interesting. I inadvertently switched things up, but it all works. It goes back to Jason's banner. There we go. So there's a team that was 5-2 going into this game. Now, it was not the best 5-2 production you'll ever see. They looked pretty lousy against some decent competition in the Big 12, but they were 5-2. They lose a 1-point game in which they blew a 2-touchdown lead at halftime against Kansas State, and Matt Wells is gone. So they wanted to get the jump on their coaching hire, looked at the schedule, which their last 4 games are basically the 4 best teams in the conference. So it's probably not going to finish well for them. And it's not gone well despite the 5-2 record going into the Kansas State game. So they pulled the plug on Matt Wells, and they're looking at Sonny Dykes. Sonny Cumbie, their offensive coordinator, is going to be the interim coach and a candidate for the permanent job. And then also trying to think of the other candidate. It'll come to me here in a second.
Yeah.
Regardless, yes, the Billy Traylor, the UTSA coach, the Texas San Antonio head coach, yes, seemed to be the top candidates. So we got Texas Tech and Oklahoma, of course, coming up on Saturday. Jason addressed the question about culture problems that was posed a few times here, and T making the comment about cornerbacks lining up 15 yards to 20 yards off the line of scrimmage.
It's very interesting, Mark, and I don't know that to that point, the aggressiveness that Oklahoma has played with on defense hasn't been there this year. And typically you have if you have a strong defensive line that Oklahoma has had, at least coming into the year, you have that opportunity that you think that you can generate pressure with your front 4. Maybe you don't need to be as aggressive on the back end, but Oklahoma's not been generating that pressure, particularly over the last couple of games. They've not played well. So I think to that point, there's a little bit of concern. Why aren't you bringing a little bit more pressure? When they have brought pressure, it was successful against Kansas. I don't know if Grinch is just kind of afraid of getting beat deep. With some of his inexperienced guys in the back end they're playing, but I don't know. I saw a couple of these comments, specifically the one that we have on the screen here, about losing control of the defense. There was something that came out earlier in the year talking about, where Grant said a lot of our kids just don't like to practice. And we believe in practice around here. So, I'm always I'm very passive on the, we need to make a change. Like there needs to be a coach needs to be fired. I always kind of err on the side of the players, in terms of players need to make plays. They were it's a very talented group. So they're not able to make play if they're not able to make plays, but at the same time, you can't fire the players, right? So you can't put new ones in, obviously, but you can't fire the players. So, I think from a coaching perspective, if again, and this is just conjecture here, we don't really know what's going on between closed doors and at practice, but if he's starting to lose the locker room a little bit, that's even more concerning than the play on the field. I mean, you would think given this team has a really good chance to where they're at right now, if they can put it together on defense, they have a really good chance to make the playoffs. And who knows if they could have a favorable matchup in the first round if who knows what happens with Cincinnati and some of those other teams around there, but they could have a favorable matchup or a good opportunity to make it to the national championship game. But they've got to whatever it is figure out if it's a rally around each other. I know a lot of teams will, if the coach isn't necessarily well liked or well received, they rally around that. So whatever they need to do, they need to find a way to rally around that and play much better because they've had a lot of problems. I think, we talked about third down. I think probably individually the biggest problem I've seen so far on this defense over and over again is just missed tackles in the open field has been their struggle. I mean, the coverage in the secondary isn't terrible. But I think they've got a lot of young kids that aren't maybe not necessarily ready. So putting more pressure and tackling in the open field, I think are the big things that they could see improvement in that area, and then obviously see their defense perform at a higher level.
We have a Florida State live show later on Wednesday, and we have James Coleman come on a fairly regular basis. He played fullback at Florida State, and he makes the comment fairly regularly to extend on one of your points. He makes the comment frequently. He said, no coaches design a play to fail. And so he very much puts the onus on the players to execute, regardless of whether that's not the best matchup or the best possible play or whatever. He tends to, not that there aren't bad schemes or bad matchups or failing to recognize certain plays you should be running against a certain defense. That is very valid, but he tends to put it more on the players as well. The comment that's being made by Miguel and others is just about, and this is another term that James uses all the time, is just having, especially on defense, just dogs. Who are your dogs? Guys that just, you hear a coach make the comment from time to time about certain players like football, and it seems like a ridiculous comment, but you know what they're saying. They're basically saying they all come out here and give a certain level of effort, and obviously we're gifted with talent to be recruited and signed at a place like this, but some of them just love playing football, and it shows, and others just recognize, okay, point A to point B, I was given this talent, this was a way to go, therefore I can do this, but they don't necessarily love to play the game.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Mark. I mean, I think you've got, in terms of having that dog, and then you have three guys on the defensive line that within this conference should be dominating at a level that they're just frankly not. Nick Benito, Isaiah Thomas, and Perion Winfrey. They show flashes from time to time, but they're not as dominant as they should be and as they need to be. I mean, there's times where Nick Benito just jumps off the tape in terms of his athletic ability, his what he's able to do, just in terms of his moves, defensive at the defensive end position, just to get to the quarterback. But there's times where he just disappears for plays, series, quarters at an end. So um, they do seem soft. That's what I'll say. Just off the cuff, they seem, when things get a little bit difficult, it tends to snowball a little bit more so than probably it should. So, just some of the things that they struggle with physically. I mean, mentally could be as big of an issue. With that, if things go bad, you let it snowball. So yeah, they don't seem to, across the board, they don't seem to have that fight that they need to have. And, I don't know if it's lack of leadership. I don't know if it's, the kind of kids that they have. If it's just the way kids are this day and age, maybe, I mean, we're not seeing that across the board. I mean, you look at how much Clemson is struggling on the offensive side of the ball, they're still playing pretty good defense, right? So, um, you know, and that's what one of the things that I think about, and when you're comparing this team to um, Georgia and Alabama, an Ohio State, even a Michigan and a Michigan State, this year. Um, they're not at the same level as those teams, specifically at Georgia and Alabama right now. When you look at, I mean, can you envision Georgia or Alabama even struggling a little bit with this Kansas team? I mean, I can't. So those teams come to play every single game. They're not always going to play great, granted, but they don't. Those teams don't typically play down to to the level of competition when they have an opportunity to blow teams out and kind of exude their dominance and put their throat on their necks. They do that. So that's what great teams do. So I think this team is still trying to figure out what it means to be a great team, and they're not there yet. I mean, this is one of the keys that I thought coming into this year from an intangible perspective that Oklahoma needed to take a jump at being able to, um, at being able to have more of a killer instinct and things like that they've not had this year, and it's kind of gotten worse. I know that there's the people that don't. I wouldn't say don't like Lincoln Riley, but I think the people that maybe question him as a head coach, I think, are the people that think he's a little too soft, and I think some of the things that he says during his press conference is very, like we talked about, it's very much coach speak a lot of times. But I think he's mentioned on several occasions, like, we're closer than you guys, we're really close, we're closer than you guys think, we're closer than the media and the national experts think. Well, I mean, you're 8 games in. You can only say that so many times. I mean, that you can say that early on in the season. When you're 8 games in, you kind of are who you are at this point. Certainly, you could, if you get some of your injured players back, you can come back and be better. But you but you're in a position where this is what kind of team that you are. So you got to figure out how to win. And I guess the only silver lining in this is they've played down to the competition so many times, and yet they still figured out ways to win. So I mean, that's one positive. But like I said, you look at the schedule, and it's not been it's not strong. The teams that Oklahoma has played this year, besides maybe Texas, and they're reeling a little bit. Aren't at the talent level, anywhere near the talent level that Oklahoma has. So now you're starting to get into a situation where you've got some teams that are closer from a talent perspective. On top of the fact that you have to go on the road for 2 of these 3 games, so it'll be interesting. It's kind of fun to think about, Mark, the fact that Oklahoma has dominated the month of November over the last 4 or 5 years. It's been, I'd have to go look at the stats, but it's been a long time since they've lost a game in November. And but this is one of the tougher Novembers that they've had. So it'll be interesting to see how it happens with Iowa State really playing a lot better now than they were at the beginning of the season, and then obviously Baylor is as well.
To Jason's point, if you take the other elite programs in the country and just go through, I've got a site that I've got a tab to that I can go to quickly, and it's got all the historical scores, meaning you can go through each team in the FBS, and it goes year by year. I guarantee that Nick Saban has not had a performance like that at Alabama against that caliber of a team. Nothing close to it.
Right.
I don't know when the last time Ohio State had a performance like that against, again, a bottom dweller in the conference. They haven't in forever.
I mean,
And
home is how they. I mean, and they finished the game strong, but the closest I can think of in recent memory, obviously you know much better than I do, but the Tulsa game this year, and not the
yeah,
Tulsa bottom dweller, but
yeah,
they did struggle a little bit in that game.
yeah,
No, your point's well taken.
yeah. So yeah, and certainly this year, my goodness, looking at Georgia, they're even taking the hammer to pretty good teams.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's like I said, it's concerning if you're an Oklahoma fan, just year in and year out, this happening, and maybe they're not. And I think Weston has mentioned this on the chat, and then I've heard some talk about maybe they're not as good as we thought they were coming in from a talent perspective. I think they're much more talented than I think they're showing on the field. Let's just say that. So, um, but like I said, I mean, part of it's a culture. There's just a lot of different, I think, factors that are pointing to where they're struggling. That the injuries are definitely a factor. When you lose 3 out of your 4 starters in the secondary, that's going to impact you from a team that's not necessarily great in the back end to begin with, right? So when you take that into effect, and then when you take into effect maybe the lack of effort and maybe to a certain degree losing a little bit of the locker room on the defensive side of the ball, then that all those things equate to a bad defense right now. But the positive thing is you are undefeated and you have the opportunity to turn it around if it's not too late at this point in the year.
Let's say Oklahoma does what we would expect them to do. What would be the reasonable expectation against Texas Tech? So that's not winning 63-7, but that's also not struggling like they did this past weekend. That's winning by 3 touchdowns. They win 45-24. Nobody thinks Texas Tech is very good. They're a top 60 team in the country, something like that.
Yeah.
The committee, so there's not an outlier to say, okay, Oklahoma's kicked it into gear or they're continuing to struggle mightily. I will be curious to see how the committee shows their hand on whether they're strongly siding with just winning and it's Oklahoma and they're talented and we believe in the brand, we believe in the roster, and they are getting the wins, or we're going to penalize them. They can't penalize them too severely. It's not like they're going to be behind a bunch of 2-loss teams by any stretch, but a few spots for continuing to struggle.
Yeah, I think so. Let's say, to your point, Mark, for the sake of argument, Oklahoma maybe they don't struggle, but they 17 to 21 point win against Texas Tech, and then you have uh, I could see a scenario which I'm sure would just enrage Oklahoma fans, but um, I wouldn't be surprised to see a scenario just based on the teams that Oklahoma has struggled against. If they had played in Oklahoma State, or maybe they played in Oregon in the non-conference, or anything like that, you could see a different scenario. But they're struggling with these teams that frankly aren't very good, right? And I think one of the things that's been brought to the table, that each and every week the quarterback that Oklahoma has faced is having either a career or a season best. Like Jason Bean last week for Kansas looked great. Max Duggan the week before had his best game of his career. So that they're struggling against some of these teams that aren't very good. So going back to your original point, let's let's just kind of go with the what ifs. Certainly, I anticipate Ohio State beating Penn State with relative ease based on where they're at right now, right? With Clifford being injured and struggling a little bit on the offensive line, I think that's it's not a recipe for success for them Saturday. And so let's just assume Michigan beats Michigan State in East Lansing. I would see a scenario where you're going to see some combination of Georgia, Cincinnati, Alabama, Ohio State, and Michigan ahead of Oklahoma, which I think would enrage a lot of Oklahoma fans. But at the same time, I think that's probably where you would see them. Specifically, when you look at Michigan, would have at that point would have a much better resume than Oklahoma. When you look at obviously Georgia and Alabama, and even Cincinnati to a certain degree, that win, obviously their schedule isn't great, but that win at Notre Dame probably trumps anything that Oklahoma has on their schedule. So yeah, I think you'll see. Yeah, I mean the brand speaks for itself. I think from that perspective, but I think what you'll probably see is there's not a lot of value for Oklahoma right now. However, they will, and that's why I said at the open, like Oklahoma fans shouldn't worry, even if they're 6. I wouldn't even be remotely concerned with that, just because of the fact that Oklahoma has these 3 marquee games here in November. All three teams are likely going to be ranked. So you beat these three teams, two of them on the road, and then you go and beat one of these three likely again in the Big 12 championship game, and it'll take care of itself.
Yes, it will. Style points are always going to be important to a certain degree, but style points are almost everything for Cincinnati right now, while the other teams are they just need to win. Just win the games. To Jason's point, Oklahoma wins all their games by 1 point. They're going to be in the playoff. Yeah, in the major conferences, the most of the schedules are backloaded to a certain extent. Certainly, these Big Ten schedules are amongst these contenders are so backloaded that they now have to go through a gauntlet. Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, and Oklahoma has the tougher teams outside of Texas to deal with now as well. That's going to just completely exceed anything Cincinnati's got to face. Where Cincinnati's got to go out there and really impress, no question.
Well, and that's why there was a lot of just discussion about Cincinnati struggled, not completely for the entire game, but only beat Navy by what 6 or 7, what it was 27-20 I think, or 27-21. But I think them struggling is much more detrimental to their success than Oklahoma struggling. That was honestly a game that they really could ill afford to play the way that they played on Saturday, because to your point, we talked about this last week, Mark, that Cincinnati, they only have really one more meaningful game. I mean, and it's SMU right now, where SMU, what are they ranked? Are they
19, I believe.
Yeah, so they have an opportunity there with a top 25 team, but other than that, they don't sniff anyone even close to the top 25 the rest of the year. So yeah, no, I think it's, like I said, I think it'll take care of itself. It may be a little bit ugly next week, seeing where Oklahoma could be ranked. I mean, and then the Michigan State factor, if they beat Michigan, maybe Oklahoma's up another notch, but still, I would be surprised if it's any higher than 5 or maybe even 6, because I think the way that they look at it, Mark, and you know, it's kind of interesting, the committee, and sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but just the way that they look at the committee, I think they value the way that the teams play on the field, at least initially. I mean, I think the record and obviously the conference champion versus not a conference champion plays into the decision making later on in the year, but I think more so, at least early on, they value who do I think is the best team, not necessarily record or not necessarily who they played or who they beat. Who do I think is the best team? Could this team beat that team? So I think looking at it, it would be hard for you to say that Oklahoma is a better team than than Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Cincinnati. Heck, you could even say, like, you could even throw Pitt in there as well, or Wake Forest. Like, if you're an Oklahoma fan, are you very confident that they could beat either one of those teams right now? I mean, heck, Wake put 70 on Army, so I know that their defense isn't playing great right now, but the way Oklahoma's defense is struggling, they wouldn't want to face either one of those teams right now.
Yeah, based on name value, as soon as you hit me with, forget Wake Forest, even they're not playing as well as Pitt. They've got a better record, but talk about a backloaded schedule. Their last 4 games, if they can make it through those 4 games, and they're not great teams, but for that league, they are. They're playing the best teams in the league at the end of the year. But you hit me with Oklahoma and Pitt. Well, my initial reaction is, of course, Oklahoma is going to beat Pitt, but I don't know. They're struggling against Nebraska and West Virginia and on down the line, Kansas. Maybe they don't beat Pitt.
Yeah, I mean, and they threw. I mean, I still have, like I said earlier, I still have a lot of respect for Clemson's defense. They've not
Yeah.
played well at all on the offensive side of the ball, but defensively, and Pitt, for the middle part of that game, second, third, and even a little bit in the fourth quarter, they kind of dominated Clemson offensively. So, yeah, I know it'll be kind of weird to think through that, but or to think that maybe Pitt could be a better team based on how the season started and where you think that they would be. But yeah, the name factor, it's there. It's always going to be there. I mean, I think for some of those teams, whether that's whether it how you decide to rank these teams, if it's a computer or a human factor or whatever. But yeah, um, it's interesting to think about. I think November is going to be really, really exciting, just all across the country.
And this week in the Big Ten, we're going to get our first glimpse of, with the two titanic matchups of Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, Michigan State, whether that's going to be some kind of a bloodbath between those four, if they're just going to really hammer it out, or I've got a bit of a possibility in me that, based on what we've seen, that a couple of those teams have played the lesser teams in that division, Michigan State, Indiana, Michigan, Rutgers, and they weren't pretty wins. They were workmanlike, kind of one-score wins, where Ohio State, they've got 3 of those in the division against the 3 lesser teams, and they were just 50-point first halves, like done by. And so we'll see. Maybe Ohio State. Well, again, we'll see if it's going to be clearly a bloodbath between the 4, or whether Ohio State will again kind of reclaim its spot as the clear number 1, and they'll be good games, but they'll just show that they're just better than the other 3.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting, Mark. I mean, I've watched Ohio State a decent amount this year, and I think they've improved a lot on the defensive side of the ball since where they were early on in the season, and they never really struggled a ton offensively. I know that in the Oregon game they had tons of yards, but they just weren't able to put touchdowns together. So that was probably the biggest game that they struggled. But Stroud looks like a Heisman contender right now, and so they're rolling on the offensive side of the ball right now. So now that the defense is kind of caught up, I think they're clearly the best team in the conference. And to your point, we'll see. We'll see what some of these other teams are able to do when the competition gets a little bit tougher. I'm probably more of a believer in Michigan than I am Michigan State right now, just based on just some of the competition that they've faced already in the year versus Michigan State. So yeah, it's going to be interesting going down the stretch. I mean, who knows? Maybe we talked about. I mean, wouldn't it be so on par for this 2021 season for Nebraska to be a team that can't find a way to beat anyone, but they find a way to beat Ohio State and Lincoln.
That would be 2021. Or we could have this crazy 2021, and with all of the craziness, when the dust settles, Oklahoma could win the Big 12, Ohio State the Big 10, and Alabama and Georgia could split, and that could be the 4-team playoff, and it could be like chalk.
Yeah, it definitely could. The one thing, could you I mean, we never talked about this specifically before the season started. I mean, I know that we talked about if we, how we felt if the just the conference championship games, just in terms if we would see any kind of difference or any kind of chaos. But maybe we should have talked about, is there any chance that either Oklahoma, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, or Clemson, any of those just wouldn't make it to their conference championship game? And that's what Clemson is struggling with right now. There's very little chance that they'll even make it, because they're 3 games behind.
Well, North Carolina State did lose, so they're 2 games behind. So Clemson's lost 2 games in the conference. Wake has lost none, so they're 2 games back, but they do get Wake.
Yeah.
So they only need Wake to lose one other game. They can beat them head to head and tie them. Now, North Carolina State's lost once, Clemson twice. NC State beat them head to head. So they're basically, in a sense, in different ways, 2 games behind both NC State and Wake.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I was just looking at the standings myself, and they host Wake, I believe, if that's right. But um, just looking at their schedule. So, but yeah, no, that would be. Yeah, they do host Wake. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be crazy if we would envision. I mean, and it could happen with Oklahoma too. I mean, just as easily as it could with Clemson. I mean, Oklahoma's schedule's backloaded. Obviously, if Oklahoma happens to lose 2 of these 3 games in November, then they could. I mean, obviously miss out on the playoffs, but miss out on the Big 12 championship game as well. I mean, I don't think there's a. I mean, obviously we know that. I mean, Georgia and Alabama are pretty much on a collision course. I mean, guess Alabama could lose to Auburn in the Iron Bowl, but still, it. Yeah, I think it'll be exciting to see how. And meanwhile, Cincinnati's just sitting back, just hoping and praying that all this chaos happens.
OU 7 Nats, despite the handle that would indicate pro Oklahoma support, it's a bit pessimistic here, looking at Oklahoma losing 3 of 4 down the stretch. Bring your comments, your questions here for the rest of the hour. Don't know where we stand on time. Oh, we are just up against it. I did not realize. So I got to head on out. I think we've shut things down. We don't have any other comments or questions here. Oklahoma, Texas Tech, obviously on Saturday. Jason's going to be here post game after the game.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, congregate right here with Jason. He'll take your comments, your questions, give the analysis on the Texas Tech game, what it all means, and as it projects forward. Jason, we appreciate it as always. Everybody head on back next Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Central Time for Oklahoma Sooners Live. Bring some friends with you so we can talk Oklahoma football as we head down the stretch in the Big 12.